The helicopter's landing skids touched the ice with a gentle crunch, but the moment the door slid open, I felt the difference between reading about Antarctic temperatures and actually experiencing them. The cold hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath despite the layers of thermal gear I'd put on before landing. "Mitchell, over here!" A woman's voice cut through the whine of the helicopter's rotors as they slowed. I grabbed my duffel bag and jumped down onto the packed snow, punching against the wind as I made my way toward a stocky figure in a heavy parka. The woman had her hand extended, her face partially obscured by a fur-lined hood and protective goggles. "Doris Knapp, camp supervisor," she said as we shook hands. Her grip was firm through our thick gloves. "Welcome to Whitmore. Let's get you inside before your face freezes off." I nodded gratefully and followed her toward a cluster of low, industrial-looking buildings about 100 yards away. The main facility wasn't much to look at. Prefab structures connected by enclosed walkways, all painted a dull gray that stood out against the endless white landscape. "How was the flight?" Doris asked, not slowing her brisk pace. "Long," I said, adjusting my bag on my shoulder. "But the view coming in was incredible." She made a noise that might have been agreement. "You'll get used to it. After a few weeks, ice is just ice." As we walked, Doris reached into her pocket and pulled out a laminated card about the size of a postcard. She handed it to me without breaking stride. "These are the Outpost survival rules. Memorize them. They're not suggestions." I looked down at the card. 5 rules were printed in bold black letters. 1. Check perimeter flags daily. 2. Avoid all red flags. Report immediately. 3. Never open exterior doors after 10 p.m. 4. Stay inside during storms. 5. Report unknown figures. Do not approach. I read through them twice, frowning. These weren't typical mining safety protocols. I'd expected rules about equipment operation, emergency procedures for cave-ins or gas leaks, maybe environmental protection guidelines. Not whatever this was. "These seem unusual for a mining operation," I said carefully. Doris stopped walking and turned to face me. Her expression was hard to read behind her goggles, but her mouth was set in a grim line. "This isn't a typical mining operation, Mitchell. We're 400 miles from the nearest research station, and the closest thing to civilization is a tiny weather monitoring outpost that's only manned during the summer months. Out here, these rules keep people alive." She started walking again before I could ask any follow-up questions. "The company orientation covered standard mining safety," she continued. "These are Whitmore-specific protocols. Follow them, and you'll complete your 3-month rotation without issues." We reached the main entrance, a heavy metal door with a keypad lock. Doris punched in a code and pulled it open. Warm air rushed out, and I felt the painful tingle of my exposed skin beginning to thaw as we stepped inside. "This is the main hub," Doris said, gesturing around a large open room. "Cafeteria's on the left, communications center and my office are through that door, medical stations at the far end. The residential quarters are in the east wing." I took in the space as I unzipped my outer layer. The room was utilitarian but comfortable enough. Tables and chairs, a few worn couches, a bulletin board covered with notices and schedules. About a dozen people were scattered around, some eating, others playing cards or reading. They glanced up as we entered, giving me curious looks before returning to their activities. "You'll meet everyone at dinner," Doris said. "For now, let's get you settled in your quarters. Your bunkmate can fill you in on the day-to-day while I finish some paperwork." She led me down a long corridor lined with numbered doors. The building was warm but had the slightly stale smell of recycled air and too many people living in close quarters. "Here you are, room 12, Doris said, stopping at a door halfway down the hall. "Dinner's at 6. My office afterward for your official briefing and assignment schedule." I thanked her, and she nodded before heading back the way we'd come. I watched her go, still trying to process the strange rules on the card in my pocket. With a sigh, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was small but efficiently organized. 2 beds on opposite walls, 2 desks, 2 narrow closets. A thin man with black hair sat at one of the desks, typing on a laptop. He looked up when I entered, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "You must be the new safety guy," he said, standing up and extending his hand. "Wade Bailey, Geological Survey Team." "Landon Mitchell," I said, shaking his hand. "And yeah, safety coordinator for the next 3 months." Wade nodded, his eyes quickly scanning me as if taking inventory. "Good to meet you. That's your side," he said, pointing to the empty bed. Bathroom shared with the room next door, doors through there. I dropped my bag on the bed and started unpacking. Wade watched me for a moment before sitting back down at his desk. "So," he said after a minute of awkward silence, "they give you the rules yet?" I pulled the laminated card from my pocket. "Just got them. They seem interesting." Wade gave a short laugh that held no humor. "That's one word for it. You replacing Jones? Robert Jones? Yeah, that's what they told me during the hiring process. Said he had to leave unexpectedly." Wade's fingers stopped moving over his keyboard. He turned slowly in his chair to face me, his expression suddenly serious. "That's what they told you? That he left unexpectedly?" Something in his tone made me stop unpacking. "That's right. Why? What happened?" Wade glanced at the door, then lowered his voice. "Robert didn't leave. He disappeared during a blizzard 6 weeks ago." I sat down on my bed, facing him. "Disappeared how?" "He went out during a storm, against the rules." Wade tapped his finger against rule number 4 on my card. "They found him the next morning about a quarter mile from the main building." "He got lost in the storm?" I asked, though something in Wade's manner told me there was more to it. Wade leaned forward, dropping his voice even lower. "He was frozen solid, Landon, completely frozen through. But here's the weird part. The door to the main building had been unlocked all night. He could have come back inside any time." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Antarctic temperature. Maybe he got disoriented in the whiteout conditions, couldn't find his way back. "That's what the official report says." Wade nodded, but his eyes darted nervously to the corners of the room. "Disorientation due to extreme weather conditions, but what?" I prompted when he didn't continue. Wade shook his head. "Nothing. Just take those rules seriously, okay? Especially the one about staying inside during storms." He turned back to his laptop, clearly done with the conversation. I finished unpacking in silence, my mind racing with questions. Why would someone leave the safety of the building during an Antarctic blizzard? And if the door was unlocked, why hadn't he come back inside? The rest of the afternoon passed quickly. I met a few more of the Outpost staff, got a more detailed tour from another worker, and tried to get my bearings in what would be my home for the next 3 months. But Wade's story about Robert Jones kept coming back to me, along with the strange rules on that laminated card. At dinner, I sat with Wade and a few others from the Geological Survey team. The food was better than I expected, hearty stew with fresh-baked bread. The conversation was casual, mostly complaints about work schedules and jokes about the limited entertainment options. No one mentioned Robert Jones or the rules. After dinner, I reported to Doris's office for my official briefing. She went over my duties as safety coordinator, daily equipment checks, monitoring environmental conditions, ensuring compliance with company protocols. All standard stuff that matched my previous experience. Not once did she mention the 5 special rules, though the laminated card sat on her desk throughout our meeting. "Any questions?" she asked when we'd gone through everything. "Just one," I said. "What happened to Robert Jones?" "My bunkmate mentioned he disappeared during a storm." Doris's expression didn't change, but I noticed her posture stiffen slightly. "Jones violated protocol during a severe weather event. He became disoriented and was unable to return to the facility. It was unfortunate but preventable, which is why we have the rules." Her tone made it clear the subject was closed. I nodded, not wanting to push further on my first day. "Your duties start tomorrow morning," she said. "Oh, 700. Get some rest, Mitchell." Back in my room, Wade was already in bed with his back to the door, though I could tell from his breathing that he wasn't asleep. I got ready for bed in silence, turning over everything I'd learned today in my mind. As I lay in the narrow bed, listening to the constant low hum of the heating system, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. There was something off about this place, something beyond the isolation and the extreme environment. The rules, Wade's nervous glances, Doris's clipped responses about Jones's death. It all pointed to something they weren't telling me. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, suddenly aware of how far from home I really was. 400 miles from the nearest outpost, surrounded by people I didn't know, in a place with rules that made no sense. And somewhere out in that frozen wasteland was whatever had happened to Robert Jones, the man whose job I'd taken, whose bed I might be sleeping in right now. What had I gotten myself into? I woke up early for my first flag inspection. The company orientation videos had mentioned this duty, but they'd glossed over the details. Just another routine safety protocol for the mining operation. I pulled on my thermal gear, layer by layer, base layer, insulating layer, outer shell. The ritual was becoming familiar now, though I'd only been at Whitmore for a few days. The room was quiet, except for Wade's soft snoring from the other bed. He wouldn't be up for another hour. Outside my window, the Antarctic dawn painted everything in shades of pale blue and gray. The outpost buildings looked like dark smudges against the endless white. I grabbed my pack with the replacement flags, checked my GPS unit, and headed out. The main hub was mostly empty this early. A couple of kitchen staff prepped breakfast, and one of the communications operators nodded at me from behind her console. I stopped by the equipment locker to sign out a radio, clipping it to my belt before pushing through the outer door. The cold hit me like a physical blow. -30 according to this morning's report, with a wind that cut straight through my layers. I pulled my hood tighter and adjusted my goggles. The perimeter flags stretched out in a rough oval around the outpost buildings, marking the boundaries of what Doris called the safe zone. I checked my GPS and headed toward the first marker. White flags mark safe areas, Jerry had explained yesterday when I'd asked about the inspection routine. Yellow means watch your step. Usually there's a crevasse or unstable ice nearby. Red? He'd paused then, his weathered face going still. Red means turn around and call it in. Don't get closer than 50 yards to a red flag. I'd asked what the red flags marked, but he'd just shaken his head and walked away. The first section of the perimeter was intact, white flags standing at attention every 20 yards or so. The wind had sculpted the snow into rippled patterns overnight, beautiful in their precision. My boots crunched through the top layer of ice as I moved from flag to flag, checking each one's position against my GPS coordinates. About halfway around the perimeter, I found my first fallen flag. The fiberglass pole had snapped clean at the base, and the white marker lay half buried in snow. I dug out the broken stump, hammered in a new pole from my pack, and secured the flag. The whole process took about 10 minutes, my fingers growing numb despite my insulated gloves. 2 more flags needed replacing before I completed the circuit, another white one and a yellow marker that had been knocked sideways by the wind. The yellow flag marked a section where the ice had fractured, creating a narrow crevasse about 15 feet deep. I stayed well back from the edge as I hammered in the replacement. The landscape looked different today than it had yesterday. A small ridge I'd noticed before had disappeared under fresh snow, and new cracks zigzagged across sections that had been smooth. The constant wind and shifting ice made the terrain a living thing, changing subtly each day. The ice is never still out here, Doris had warned during my orientation. That's why we check the flags daily. What was safe yesterday might not be safe today. I finished the inspection and headed back toward the main building, making notes in my tablet about the replaced flags. The sun was higher now, turning the snow painfully bright. Another day at Whitmore Antarctic Outpost was officially underway. The next morning's inspection went much the same. 3 fallen flags, all white this time. The third morning, I found a section where the perimeter seemed to have shifted overnight. According to my GPS, 2 white flags were now about 5 yards off their marked positions. I radioed into Doris. Mitchell to base. I've got 2 markers off position in section 4. Her voice crackled back almost immediately. How far off? About 5 yards southeast. Ground looks stable, but there's a new pressure ridge forming nearby. Replace them at the correct coordinates. Mark the ridge on your map. Copy that. I hammered in new flags at the proper positions and continued my circuit. The ridge she'd mentioned was a new feature, a long curved wall of ice pushing up from below. It hadn't been there yesterday. On the 4th morning, I woke before my alarm. The wind had picked up overnight, howling around the corners of the building. I layered up, grabbed my gear, and headed out into the gray pre-dawn. The wind made the inspection harder, pushing against me as I walked the perimeter. Snow whipped into my face despite my goggles and hood. I replaced a fallen white flag near the equipment shed, then continued around toward the eastern edge of the perimeter. I was checking a section of yellow flags when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, where I knew a yellow flag had stood yesterday, something red fluttered against the white landscape. Even from this distance, something about it looked wrong. The other flags bent and swayed in the wind, but this one stood perfectly still, as if planted in concrete instead of ice. I stopped walking and pulled out my binoculars. The red flag was identical to the ones I'd seen in the storage locker, same size, same material. But while the other flags along the perimeter moved with the wind, this one didn't budge. It stood rigidly upright, its fabric somehow both fluttering and completely still at the same time. My brain couldn't quite process what I was seeing. I remembered the rules. Rule number 2, avoid all red flags. Report immediately. I unclipped my radio. Mitchell to base. I found a red flag in Section 6, Eastern Perimeter. Over. Doris's voice came back instantly, sharper than usual. Confirmed red flag sighting. What's your position? I checked my GPS. I'm about 50 yards west of it. The flag is standing where yellow marker 612 was yesterday. Do not approach. I repeat, do not approach the flag. Return to base immediately. Copy that. Returning to base. I hesitated, still watching the flag through my binoculars. Doris, the flag isn't moving in the wind. Is that normal? There was a pause before she answered. Mitchell, listen carefully. Lower your binoculars. Do not look directly at the flag. Turn around and walk back to base now. Something in her voice made my skin crawl. I lowered the binoculars and turned away from the red flag, but as I did, I felt something. A tug, like a hook caught behind my ribs, pulling me toward the flag instead of away from it. I took a step toward base, and the feeling intensified. A pressure in my chest, an urge to turn around, to walk toward the red marker instead. I gritted my teeth and kept walking away, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Mitchell, report. Are you moving away from the flag? Doris's voice was tight with tension. Yes, I managed. Heading back now. ETA 5 minutes. With each step away from the flag, the pulling sensation faded. By the time I reached the main building, it was gone completely, leaving only a dull headache behind my eyes. Doris met me at the door, her face grim. Inside, now. She led me straight to her office and closed the door behind us. Tell me exactly what happened. I described finding the red flag, how it stood unnaturally still despite the wind, and the strange pulling sensation I'd felt when trying to walk away. Doris listened without interrupting, her expression giving nothing away. When I finished, she nodded once. You did the right thing. Not everyone does. What are the red flags? I asked. What do they mark? She looked at me for a long moment. They don't mark anything we put there. They appear on their own, always in different places. Sometimes where a yellow or white flag was before, sometimes in completely unmarked areas. That's impossible. Flags don't just appear. A lot of impossible things happen out here, Mitchell. She leaned forward. Did you feel anything else besides the pulling sensation? Disorientation, nausea, visual disturbances? I shook my head. Just the headache after I looked at it through the binoculars. Good, that's mild. It means you kept your distance. She made a note on her tablet. You're off flag duty for today. I'll send Jerry out with the snowcat to remove that marker. Is it safe to remove them? With the right equipment, yes. We have protocols. She stood up. Get some rest. Report to the medical station in 2 hours for a checkup. I spent the rest of the day helping with equipment maintenance inside the main building. The headache faded after a couple of hours. The medical check showed nothing unusual, though the doctor asked me the same questions Doris had, plus a few about my sleep patterns and whether I'd had any unusual dreams. That evening, I found Jerry alone in the common area, nursing a cup of coffee and reading something on his tablet. I grabbed a coffee of my own and sat down across from him. Heard you had an exciting morning, he said without looking up. If you call staring at a flag exciting. He set down his tablet. Red flags aren't just flags, kid. They're warnings. Warnings of what? Jerry glanced around the room, but we were alone. Nobody knows for sure. They started appearing about 3 years ago, not long after they expanded the mining operation. At first, we thought it was some kind of prank, someone sneaking out at night and planting them, but the security cameras never showed anything. Doris said they appear on their own. Yeah, he rubbed his beard. One day a spot's marked with a regular flag, next day it's red. No footprints, no sign of the original flag, just replaced. I thought about how still the flag had been, defying the wind. What happens if you get too close? Jerry's face darkened. Depends. Headaches are common, nightmares. Some people hear things that aren't there. And the worst cases? I prompted when Jerry fell silent. He took a long sip of his coffee, eyes fixed on something beyond the wall. Dorothy Ryan, she was our geologist, came in with the second wave of staff about 2 years ago. Smart woman, PhD from Berkeley. She thought the red flags were some kind of magnetic anomaly. What happened to her? She went out to study one, took readings, soil samples, the works. Jerry's voice dropped lower. We told her not to, but she said the scientific method doesn't make exceptions for superstition. A chill that had nothing to do with the Antarctic temperature ran through me. And? Search team found her the next morning, about 10 feet from the flag. She was just sitting there in the snow, eyes open, breathing, but nobody home. He tapped his temple. Doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with her. She just wouldn't respond to anything. Voices, touch, pain, nothing. Like her mind went somewhere and couldn't find its way back. Is she still here? I asked, looking around as if I might spot her sitting in a corner. Jerry shook his head. They evacuated her on the next supply plane. Last I heard, she's in some long-term care facility in Australia. Still the same, breathing, blinking, but that's about it. I thought about the pulling sensation I'd felt, that hook behind my ribs trying to draw me toward the red flag. Had Dorothy felt the same thing? Had she given in to it? What about Robert Jones? I asked. The guy I replaced. Did his death have something to do with the flags? Jerry's expression closed off. You should ask Doris about that. I did. She said he violated protocol during a storm. Then that's what happened. Jerry stood up, gathering his things. Word of advice, Mitchell. Follow the rules. All of them. They're not suggestions out here. He left me sitting alone with my cooling coffee and too many questions. Outside the windows, darkness had fallen completely, turning the glass into mirrors that reflected the common room back at me. Beyond that thin barrier was a wasteland of ice where flags appeared out of nowhere and stood unnaturally still in howling winds. I thought about Dorothy Ryan sitting catatonic in the snow and Robert Jones frozen to death with an unlocked door just yards away. I thought about the rules on my laminated card, rules that seemed less arbitrary with each passing day. The sensation I'd felt near the red flag lingered in my memory, that inexplicable pull, like homesickness for a place I'd never been. Part of me wanted to feel it again, to understand it. A larger, more rational part recognized that curiosity as dangerous. I finished my coffee and headed back to my room, the empty corridors suddenly seeming longer and darker than they had before. Wade was already asleep when I got there, or pretending to be. As I lay in bed that night, I kept seeing the red flag in my mind, perfectly still while everything around it moved in the wind, like it existed in its own pocket of reality, following different rules than the rest of the world. I wondered what would have happened if I'd given in to that pull, if I'd walked toward the flag instead of away from it. Would I have ended up like Dorothy Ryan, lights on but nobody home? Or would I have discovered whatever secret the red flags were hiding? I didn't know, but I was starting to understand why everyone at Whitmore followed the rules without question. Out here, 400 miles from the nearest outpost, the cost of curiosity could be higher than anyone was willing to pay. I sat alone in the common area, flipping through the safety maintenance manuals I'd been putting off reading all week. The clock on the wall showed 11:30, and the rest of the outpost had gone quiet hours ago. Most people crashed early around here. The constant darkness outside and physical work made sleep come easy for everyone except me. The manual section on emergency protocols for equipment failures was dry, but I forced myself to focus. The diagrams of pressure valves and emergency shutoffs blurred together after a while. I rubbed my eyes and reached for my coffee mug, now cold. 3 loud, deliberate knocks broke the silence. I froze, my hand still on the mug. The knocks had come from the main building door, the exterior door that led directly outside. "Hello?" A male voice called from outside. "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." I set down the manual and stood up, moving cautiously toward the entrance hallway. The voice sounded again, clearer now. "Please, I'm cold. I got lost in the dark. Can someone let me in?" Something about the voice seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. I stopped several feet from the door, remembering rule number 3 on my laminated card: never open exterior doors after 10 p.m. "Who's out there?" I called, keeping my distance from the door. "It's Robert," the voice answered immediately. "Robert Jones. I've been trying to find my way back. Please open the door." My blood went cold. Robert Jones, the safety coordinator I'd replaced. The man Wade told me had frozen to death 6 weeks ago. "Landon, is that you?" The voice continued. "I know you're the new safety guy. I've seen you doing my old job. Please, man, I'm freezing out here." I backed away from the door. The voice matched exactly with the one I'd heard in the orientation videos, the same ones where Robert Jones had explained safety protocols. Videos that had been recorded when he was still alive. 3 more knocks, harder this time. "Landon, please. I can explain everything if you just let me in. I wasn't dead. I got lost. I've been trying to find my way back." I retreated to the common area, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. Wade had told me they'd found Robert's body, frozen solid a quarter-mile from the building. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. "I can see you through the window. Please, I don't have much time. It's getting colder." I glanced toward the windows, but the blackout curtains were drawn. Standard procedure after dark. There was no way anyone could see inside. "If you don't let me in, I'll die out here. Again, is that what you want? To be responsible for that?" The voice had taken on a pleading tone that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my radio from the table, wondering if I should call Doris. But what would I say? That a dead man was knocking on our door? For the next 20 minutes, I sat rigid in my chair, listening as Robert's voice grew increasingly desperate. The knocking pattern changed, sometimes rapid and frantic, sometimes slow and methodical, sometimes stopping altogether before starting again just as I began to hope it was over. "They're lying to you, Landon," Robert's voice called out, now sounding angry. "About what happened to me, about what's really going on here. Let me in and I'll tell you everything." I gripped the arms of my chair, fighting the urge to look outside. The rules existed for a reason. Wade had told me the door had been unlocked the night Robert died, yet he'd frozen to death anyway. Something wasn't adding up. "You'll end up just like me if you stay," the voice warned. "Or worse, like Dorothy." My breath caught. Dorothy Ryan, the geologist Jerry had told me about. The woman who'd studied a red flag and ended up catatonic. The knocking finally stopped around midnight. The sudden silence felt almost worse than the persistent pounding had been. I waited another hour, unable to move from my spot, before finally heading back to my room. Wade was sound asleep, or at least pretending to be. I climbed into bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled me under. Morning came too soon. I woke groggy and disoriented, wondering if I'd dreamed the whole thing. But the memory of Robert's voice was too vivid, too specific to have been a nightmare. After a quick shower and change of clothes, I grabbed my coat and headed outside to check the area around the main door. The morning light was dim. We were still weeks away from seeing actual sunlight, but the work lamps illuminated the area well enough. Fresh footprints marked the snow outside the main entrance. Human-sized impressions circled the building multiple times, creating a path that wound around toward the back before heading off in the direction of the mining equipment. I knelt down to examine one of the prints more closely. No tread pattern. The impressions looked like they'd been made by bare feet, smooth, uniform depressions in the snow. Who would walk barefoot in -30-degree weather? I followed the tracks with my eyes as they disappeared toward the equipment yard. Something about their pattern seemed wrong. The stride length was inconsistent, sometimes normal, sometimes impossibly long, as if the person had leaped several feet between steps. Back inside, I found Doris in the cafeteria having her morning coffee. She looked up as I approached her table. "Morning, Mitchell. You look like hell." "Someone was at the main door last night," I said, sitting across from her. "Around 11:30. They were knocking and asking to be let in." Doris's expression didn't change. "And did you open the door?" "No, of course not. Rule 3. She nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "Good. And who did they say they were?" I hesitated, then decided there was no point holding back. "They said they were Robert Jones." Doris set down her mug. For a moment, she looked tired, older than her 45 years. "I figured as much. It's been about 2 weeks since the last time." "The last time?" I repeated. "Robert's voice has been heard several times since his death," she said matter-of-factly. "Always after 10 p.m., always begging to be let inside." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "But that's impossible." "Maybe." She shrugged. "But it happens all the same." "There are footprints outside," I told her. "They go all the way around the building and then head toward the mining equipment. But they don't have any tread pattern. They look like bare feet made them." Doris nodded grimly. "The rules exist for important reasons, Mitchell. They're not suggestions or guidelines. They're what keep us alive out here. "What is this place?" I asked, leaning forward. "What's really going on? This isn't just a mining operation, is it?" "It is a mining operation," she said. "But there are complications, things we don't understand, things we've learned to live with by following certain protocols. Like not opening doors after 10. Like not opening doors after 10, she confirmed. Like staying away from red flags. Like reporting unknown figures but never approaching them." She finished her coffee and stood up. "You did the right thing last night, Mitchell. Remember that feeling? The one that told you to stay put even when everything else was telling you to open that door. That feeling will keep you alive here." I watched her walk away, my mind racing with questions she hadn't answered, but one thing had become crystal clear. The rules weren't arbitrary restrictions or corporate paranoia. They were protection, a barrier between us and whatever waited outside in the Antarctic darkness. Whatever had been knocking on that door last night, it wasn't Robert Jones. Not anymore. The weather turned mean in my third week at the Outpost. I'd known Antarctic weather could be brutal, but when the warning came through that morning, even the veterans looked worried. 80+ mile-per-hour winds expected by nightfall, the meteorologist announced over breakfast. Storm systems moving faster than predicted. I watched the old-timers exchange glances across the cafeteria. Jerry set down his fork, his weathered face grim. "That's a bad one," he muttered to no one in particular. Doris called an emergency meeting an hour later. We all packed into the common area, the room buzzing with nervous energy. She stood at the front, clipboard in hand, her face serious. "Everyone listen up. Category 4 storm approaching from the east. Expected duration is 36 to 48 hours. All outdoor operations are suspended effective immediately." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each of us. "I want to be crystal clear about this. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, leaves any building during this storm. Anyone caught outside will be fired on the spot and on the next transport out when weather clears. This isn't about productivity. It's about keeping you alive." Wade leaned toward me. "Last year, 2 guys from maintenance thought they could make it between buildings during a storm half this size. They were found a quarter-mile away when it cleared." "Dead?" I whispered. He shook his head. "Wish they were. Severe frostbite. Both lost fingers. One lost his nose. Faces permanently damaged from windburn." Doris continued with assignments for storm preparations, and everyone scattered to secure equipment and check supplies. I spent the rest of the day helping the maintenance team board up the few regular windows and checking emergency generators. By dinner time, I could hear the wind picking up, moaning around the corners of the building. The storm arrived right on schedule, hitting us full force just after 8. The walls of the outpost, built to withstand these conditions, still creaked and groaned under the assault. Most people retreated to their quarters early, but I stayed in the common area. The reinforced observation windows were small but offered a view of the storm. For the first few hours, I watched the snow whip past, creating white walls that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The floodlights outside created an eerie glow that barely penetrated the maelstrom. By 11, I was alone in the common area. The storm had intensified, the wind howling so loudly it sounded like something alive and angry. I sat with a book I couldn't focus on, the words blurring as my attention kept drifting to the windows and the chaos beyond. Just before midnight, I looked up from my book and froze. Through the swirling snow, I saw something that made no sense. A splash of bright red, visible despite the whiteout conditions. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks, but when I looked again, it was still there. A red flag, standing perfectly straight about 50 yards from the building. I moved closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass. The flag wasn't just visible. It was completely still, utterly unaffected by the hurricane-force winds that bent everything else in their path. It seemed to glow with its own inner light, a beacon in the storm. My first thought was that it shouldn't be possible. Nothing could stand upright in those winds. My second thought was more troubling. Red flags meant danger. What if something had happened to the mining equipment? What if there was a pressure buildup or gas leak that needed immediate attention? I felt a strange pull toward the flag, an almost physical sensation like someone had tied a string to my chest and was gently tugging. Before I fully realized what I was doing, I'd walked to the equipment room and started pulling on my thermal gear. Base layer, insulating layer, outer shell, gloves, boots. Each item I put on felt like someone else was moving my hands. I kept thinking about the flag, standing impossibly still, glowing red against the white. What if people were in danger? What if I was the only one who'd seen it? I made my way to the main door, my heart pounding in my ears louder than the storm. My hand reached for the lock, fingers trembling slightly, and then I stopped. Jerry's voice suddenly came back to me, clear as if he were standing right beside me. His words about Dorothy Ryan, found catatonic near a red flag. About Robert Jones, my predecessor, who broke protocol during a storm and ended up frozen solid. "Rules keep you alive out here," he'd told me. Nothing else. I backed away from the door, my hand dropping to my side. The pulling sensation in my chest intensified, almost painful now, but I forced myself to turn away. Back in the common area, I deliberately positioned myself in the chair facing away from the windows. My whole body felt wrong, like I was fighting some basic instinct. I needed to go outside, to check that flag, to understand why it stood unmoving in winds that could knock a man flat. I sat there for hours, rigid in the chair, refusing to look. The pull never completely went away, but it weakened as the night wore on. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke with a start as the first shift workers entered the common area. "Storm's breaking," someone said. I stood up, muscles stiff from sleeping in the chair, and approached the window cautiously. The sky had lightened to a pale gray, and the wind had dropped to merely strong instead of catastrophic. I could see the outpost buildings clearly now. The snow drifted high against their walls. Where the red flag had stood, there was nothing, just smooth, untouched snow, as if nothing had ever been there. "You okay, Mitchell? You look like you've seen a ghost." It was Jerry, cup of coffee in hand. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Just didn't sleep well with all the noise." He nodded, seeming to accept this, but his eyes lingered on me a moment too long. As I walked back to my room to change, a cold realization washed over me that had nothing to do with the Antarctic temperature. I understood now how close I'd come to breaking a rule, perhaps the most important one. Whatever that flag had been, wherever it had come from, it wasn't meant to help us, and I'd almost walked right out to it. I spotted the figure during my 4th week at Whitmore. It was early morning, the sky still dark except for the faint blue glow at the horizon that passed for dawn this time of year. The temperature gauge read -35 when I stepped outside for my routine flag check, my breath instantly crystallizing in front of my face. I'd gotten used to the procedure by now. Walk the perimeter, check each flag, replace any that had fallen, note any changes in the landscape. Simple, methodical work that gave me time to think. The mining operation hummed in the distance, a constant background noise that had become almost comforting in its regularity. I was halfway through my circuit when I saw it, a dark shape moving slowly across the ice field, well beyond our perimeter markers. At first I thought it might be a shadow cast by one of the distant equipment pieces, but then it moved again, a deliberate shift that was unmistakably human. I stopped, squinting against the harsh glare of snow. The figure was about 200 yards out, just a black smudge against white. No one was supposed to be in that sector today. I checked the schedule myself before heading out. I pulled my binoculars from my pack and raised them to my eyes. The cold metal bit into my skin despite my gloves. Through the lenses, I could make out what looked like standard-issue Outpost gear. The same heavy-duty parka we all wore, hood pulled up, dark pants, boots. The figure moved with an odd, jerky motion like someone walking against a strong wind or struggling through deep snow. But the surface where they walked looked packed, and even from my vantage point, I watched for several minutes, tracking their progress. Something wasn't right. Despite their continuous movement, they maintained the exact same distance from the perimeter. They'd move forward, then slightly to the side, but never any closer or farther away, like they were walking along an invisible barrier. I lowered the binoculars and unclipped my radio. "Base, this is Mitchell. I've got an unidentified individual approximately 200 yards northeast of marker 23. Over." The radio crackled with static before Doris's voice came through, sharp and clear. "Mitchell, confirm visual details. Over." Single figure in what appears to be standard issue gear, moving with unusual gait, maintaining consistent distance from perimeter despite continuous movement. No scheduled personnel in that area. Over. There was a pause, longer than normal. When Doris spoke again, her voice had dropped to a lower register. "Mitchell, return to base immediately. Do not approach. I repeat, do not approach the figure. Acknowledge. Over." The urgency in her tone made my skin prickle despite the layers of thermal gear. Acknowledged. Returning to base. Over. I took one last look through the binoculars. The figure had stopped moving and appeared to be facing in my direction. Even with the magnification, I couldn't make out any facial features beneath the hood, just darkness where a face should be. I packed up quickly and headed back toward the main building, walking faster than necessary. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, but the figure remained in place, a dark sentinel on the white plain. Back inside, I found Doris waiting for me in the equipment room, arms crossed over her chest. "You saw one of them," she said. It wasn't a question. "One of what, exactly?" I asked, removing my outer gear. My fingers fumbled with the zipper, still cold despite the gloves. "We call them visitors. They show up regularly. Have been since before I got here." I hung my parka on its hook. "Are they from another research station? Lost hikers?" Doris let out a short, humorless laugh. "No research station would send people out alone, and there are no hikers this far into the continent." She gestured for me to follow her. We walked to her office, the small room cluttered with maps, equipment logs, and weather reports. She closed the door behind us. "Sit," she said, pointing to the chair across from her desk. I sat while she remained standing, looking out the small window that faced the direction where I'd seen the figure. "First sighting was logged 12 years ago," she said without turning around. "Back then, we thought it was someone from another station. Sent out a team to make contact." She turned to face me. 2 of the 4 never came back. The other 2 were found wandering separately, severely hypothermic with no memory of what happened after they got within 50 yards of the figure. "Jesus," I muttered. Since then, we've had 43 confirmed sightings. They always keep their distance while moving, never approach the station directly. We've tried radio contact, visual signals, even loudspeakers. No response. "What are they?" Doris sat down heavily in her chair. "If I knew that, Mitchell, I wouldn't need the rules, would I?" She pulled out a file from her desk drawer and flipped it open. Inside were photographs, grainy, distant shots of figures similar to what I'd seen. Sometimes they appear alone, sometimes in groups of 2 or 3. They vanish when storms hit, reappear days or weeks later. They never leave footprints that we can find. They never carry equipment. They never signal distress. She closed the file. And anyone who tries to make contact either doesn't come back or comes back changed. I thought about the strange, halting gait, the way the figure maintained that precise distance. "So Rule 5, I said. "Report unknown figures, do not approach." "Exactly. See one, report it, come back inside. Simple as that." "But what if someone's actually in trouble out there? What if—" "Mitchell," Doris cut me off, her voice sharp. "No one is in trouble out there because no one should be out there. Anyone in that gear, that far from base, moving like that, they're not human, not anymore." The certainty in her voice sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. "What do you mean, not anymore?" She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "The first 2 figures we ever documented. We're pretty sure they were Erickson and Patel, the 2 team members who never came back from that initial contact attempt." My mouth went dry. "You think these figures are—" "What? People who got lost?" "I think whatever is out there takes people and sends back something that looks like them but isn't." She leaned forward. "Listen carefully, Mitchell. These sightings require reporting, but they should never, ever be investigated. You see one, you call it in, you come back. That's it. No exceptions, no heroics, no curiosity. Clear?" I nodded slowly. "Clear." "Good." She stood up, signaling our meeting was over. "The mining company pays us well to extract resources from this godforsaken place. Our job is to do that and stay alive. The rules help with the staying alive part." As I got up to leave, she added, "One more thing. They never crossed the perimeter flags. Not once in 12 years. That's why we check them daily, why we replace any that fall. The perimeter is our safety line." I left her office with more questions than answers, but one thing was crystal clear. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were survival mechanisms, developed through trial and error, possibly paid for in blood. Over the next few days, I found myself scanning the horizon more frequently during my checks, looking for dark shapes against the endless white. The figure didn't reappear, but knowing it might be out there, watching, waiting, made every trip outside the building feel different. The other workers noticed my increased vigilance. Jerry found me in the common area one evening, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window. "Heard you saw one of our friends," he said, dropping into the chair beside me. "Is that what we're calling them now?" He shrugged. "Better than the things that might be dead co-workers." I winced. Doris told me about Erickson and Patel. Yeah, that was before my time, but the stories stick around. He glanced toward the window. "I've seen them 3 times in my 4 years here, always the same. They walk back and forth, never getting closer, never responding. It's like they're patrolling." "Or trapped," I suggested. Jerry gave me a sharp look. "Don't start thinking like that. That's how people end up joining them." I nodded, remembering Doris's warning. "I know. Report and return, no exceptions." "Good man." He clapped me on the shoulder. "You'll make it through your rotation just fine." But as the days passed and my final week at Whitmore approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building. The weather reports showed a severe storm system developing to the east, potentially the worst of the season. The mining operation was rushing to secure equipment before it hit. And then it happened. My last morning inspection before the storm lockdown. I stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness, the wind already picking up, carrying ice crystals that stung my exposed skin. I made it halfway around the perimeter when I saw them. 3 red flags, standing perfectly still despite the increasing wind, spaced evenly along the eastern edge. They hadn't been there the previous evening. And beyond them, barely visible in the dim light, 3 figures stood watching the outpost. I raised my binoculars. The figures wore our gear but moved with that same unnatural gait. As I watched, one raised its arm and pointed directly at me. My radio crackled to life without me touching it. "Landon." The voice was distorted but recognizable. "Robert Jones. The storm's coming. They're coming with it. You need to know what's happening with the flags." I looked at my watch. It was 5:30 in the morning, well before the 10 p.m. curfew for opening doors, but every instinct told me this was wrong. "Landon, please, I don't have much time. The missing flags, the figures in the distance, it's all connected. Let me in, and I'll explain everything." I stood frozen, my commitment to following protocol facing its greatest challenge yet. 3 rule violations confronted me at once. Red flags had appeared without explanation. Unknown figures watched from the perimeter, and a dead man's voice called to me through my radio. The wind howled louder, the storm advancing faster than predicted. Snow began to swirl around me, reducing visibility. Through the thickening white, I could still see the red flags glowing with that unnatural light, unmoved by the strengthening gale. "Last chance, Landon," Robert's voice said, clearer now despite the storm. "What they told you about me isn't true. What they told you about this place isn't true. Let me show you." I stayed indoors throughout the storm, watching from the reinforced observation window as snow whipped past in blinding sheets. The red flags glowed in the darkness, visible even through the worst of it. Their light pulsed slowly like a heartbeat, completely unaffected by the hurricane-force winds that bent metal structures and threatened to tear the roof from our shelter. I sat rigid in my chair, hands gripping the armrests. The pulling sensation in my chest had returned, stronger than before, like invisible hooks caught behind my ribs. I closed my eyes, trying to block out his words, but they wormed their way into my thoughts anyway. What if he really was Robert? What if he'd somehow survived, lost in the storm, and now needed help? But then I remembered what Jerry had told me about Dorothy Ryan, found catatonic near a red flag, and Wade's story about the maintenance workers who'd lost fingers, noses, parts of their faces to the cold when they broke protocol. I opened my eyes and looked toward the window. The red flags pulsed brighter now, their glow seeming to reach toward the building like fingers of light stretching across the snow. "Landon," a new voice called through the radio. A woman's voice, soft and familiar, though I couldn't place it. "Landon, please help us." My heart jumped. The radio shouldn't be picking up other transmissions. We used a closed system. Another voice joined in, then another. Soon my radio buzzed with a chorus of pleas, each calling my name, begging for help, for warmth, for rescue. I recognized some of the voices now. Peterson, who died last year when a drilling platform collapsed. Chen, who'd suffered equipment failure in her suit 2 winters ago. People I'd never met but whose names appeared in the memorial plaque in the common area. The dead were calling to me. I stood up, my body moving almost against my will, drawn by the pulling sensation that now felt like a physical force. 3 steps toward the door before I caught myself. "No," I whispered, forcing myself back to the chair. "No." The voices grew more insistent, the radio crackling with overlapping pleas and warnings. I grabbed it and turned the volume down, but the voices continued, somehow audible even at the lowest setting. I spent the night in that chair, fighting the urge to open the door, to walk out into the storm toward those pulsing red lights. At some point, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. I woke to silence. The common area was empty, gray morning light filtering through the windows. The storm had passed. My body ached from spending the night in the chair. I stood, stretching stiff muscles, and approached the observation window. Outside, the landscape had transformed. Fresh snow covered everything in smooth, untouched white. The mining equipment stood half buried in drifts. The perimeter flags, regular white and yellow markers, stood at their designated points, some leaning from the wind, but all in their proper places. No red flags, no footprints, no signs anyone or anything had been outside during the storm. I picked up my radio and checked it. The battery was dead, completely drained, though it had been fully charged yesterday. When Jerry came in for coffee, he looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Rough night?" he asked. I nodded. The storm was loud. He studied my face for a moment longer than normal, then shrugged. Wasn't as bad as they predicted. Barely Category 3 by the end. I didn't tell him about the voices or the flags. What would be the point? There was no evidence, nothing to show what had happened. Just my word against the unmarked snow outside. The rest of my 3-month rotation passed without incident. No more red flags appeared during my perimeter checks. No more voices came through my radio. No more figures watched from the boundary. I did my job, followed the protocols, and counted the days. Maybe that's why they left me alone. I'd proven I wouldn't break the rules. On my final day, Doris called me into her office. She sat behind her desk, reviewing something on her tablet. "Mitchell," she said, looking up as I entered, "your rotation ends tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, standing just inside the doorway. "You've done good work here, followed the protocols to the letter." She set down her tablet. "Not everyone adapts so well to our unique circumstances." I said nothing, waiting. "I'd like to offer you a permanent position," she continued. "Safety coordinator with a 20% pay increase over your current contract. You've proven yourself reliable, and that's rare out here." The offer was better than I expected. The money would help pay off my student loans years early. The job security was something I hadn't had since graduating, but I thought about those red flags pulsing in the storm, the voices of the dead calling my name, the pulling sensation that had nearly drawn me outside. "Thank you for the offer," I said carefully, "but I'll be heading back as scheduled." Doris nodded, unsurprised. "I thought you might say that. Still, the offer stands if you change your mind." "What is this place really?" I asked, the question that had burned in my mind for 3 months finally escaping. "The flags, the figures, the voices. What's happening here?" She looked at me for a long moment. "Does it matter? The protocols work. Follow them, and you stay alive." "But, Mitchell," she cut me off. "Some questions don't have answers you'd want to hear. Some answers wouldn't help you sleep at night." I understood then that she knew more than she'd ever tell me, more than anyone would ever put in an official report. The rules weren't just rules, they were a barrier between us and something else, something that waited beyond the perimeter. The next morning, I boarded the helicopter with my duffel bag. The pilot nodded a greeting as I climbed in and strapped myself to the seat. The rotors spun up, drowning out all other sound. As we lifted off, I looked down at the outpost growing smaller below us, the gray prefab buildings, the mining equipment, the perimeter flags marking the boundary of safety. And there, at the eastern edge where no flag should have been, stood a single red marker, perfectly straight, its fabric completely still despite the helicopter's downdraft stirring the snow around it. I watched it until the outpost disappeared from view, knowing I would never return to that place, and knowing too that I would never fully leave it behind. Some places change you. Some rules, once learned, can never be forgotten. 3 months at Whitmore Antarctic Outpost had taught me that survival sometimes means accepting rules without understanding them. Sometimes the only answer is that there are no answers, just protocols to follow and boundaries never to cross. As the helicopter carried me back toward civilization, I wondered how many others had seen what I'd seen, heard what I'd heard, and chosen to walk away, and how many had given in to the pull, opened the door, approached the red flags, and never returned to tell what they'd found.